The question of where a crime is committed, or even who has the authority to investigate and prosecute it, might seem straightforward, but as Chapter 1 of Criminal Procedure reveals, these preliminary considerations are anything but simple, often leading to complex legal battles over jurisdiction. Daniel, what's at the heart of these foundational concepts?
That's right, Lily. This chapter is all about setting the stage for a criminal case, focusing heavily on jurisdiction and the specific requirements for its exercise. It really emphasizes that for any court to act, it must first have the legal power to do so. These cases show how these seemingly dry procedural rules can dramatically alter the outcome of a prosecution.
Let's start with the cornerstone case of Trainas v. People. The Supreme Court highlighted that where life or liberty is affected by its proceedings, courts must keep strictly within the limits of the law authorizing them to take jurisdiction. This seems like a critical caution for all courts, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. In Trainas, the petitioner, Hector Trainas, was accused of estafa. He argued that the Makati Regional Trial Court lacked territorial jurisdiction because the prosecution failed to prove the offense or any of its essential elements occurred in Makati City. The crucial point was that while the information alleged Makati as the place, the evidence, like the deed of sale, pointed to Iloilo City.
So even if the information says it happened in Makati, if the evidence points elsewhere, the court doesn't have jurisdiction.
Precisely. The Supreme Court ultimately sided with Trainas, dismissing the case without prejudice. They found that the trial courts and Court of Appeals findings on venue were conclusions without any citation of specific evidence, essentially built on speculation. The location where money was delivered was key, and the prosecution couldn't prove it was Makati.
That's a powerful reminder that proper venue isn't just a technicality, it's a jurisdictional matter that can derail an entire case. Moving on, the Lacson versus Executive Secretary case brings up an even more complex jurisdictional question, involving high-ranking officials and the specialized court, the Sandiganbayan.
Indeed, this case stemmed from the infamous Kuratong Baling incident, where police officers, including Panfilo Lacson, were charged with multiple murder. The central issue was whether the Sandiganbayan had jurisdiction. This hinged on the interpretation of RA 8249, which defined the Sandiganbayan's jurisdiction, particularly for offenses in relation to office committed by public officials.
And the petitioners, including Lacson, argued that the law was unconstitutional, specifically challenging Sections 4 and 7 of RA 8249. What were their main points against the law?
They claimed the law was tailor-made for their case, violating due process and equal protection. They also argued its retroactive application was ex post facto, depriving them of a two-tiered appeal. However, the Supreme Court upheld the law's constitutionality, stating it merely redefined jurisdiction and wasn't penal in nature, so ex post facto didn't apply.
So while the law itself was constitutional, did the Sandiganbayan actually have jurisdiction over the murder charges against Lacson and the others?
The court found that the amended informations were deficient. Even with the new law, the informations failed to sufficiently allege that the murders were committed in relation to their public offices. This intimate connection between the crime and official function wasn't clearly stated in the factual averments, making the charges plain murder, which fell under the regional trial court's jurisdiction, not the Sandiganbayan's.
That's a crucial distinction. It's not enough to just name the official. The specific connection to their office must be spelled out. Next, People v. Logan introduces another temporal element to jurisdiction. When is it actually determined?
This case involved an estafa charge for a bouncing check. The key was that the penalty for estafa changed after the crime was committed, but before the criminal information was filed. The city court dismissed the case because the new heavier penalty exceeded its jurisdiction.
So, jurisdiction is determined by the law in force at the time of the commencement of the criminal action, not when the offense was committed.
Exactly. The Supreme Court affirmed the dismissal, clarifying that subject matter jurisdiction is indeed measured by the law in effect when the action begins. However, it also emphasized that this doesn't mean a heavier penalty is retroactively imposed. The proper court would try the case, but apply the more favorable penalty existing at the time the crime was committed.
a nuanced point, ensuring fairness while upholding proper court authority. The Asistio v. People case also grapples with statutory interpretation and its impact on jurisdiction.
Jocelyn Asistio was charged with violating the Cooperative Code. The RTC initially dismissed the case, arguing that the offense either had no penal sanction or carried a penalty that fell under the Metropolitan Trial Court's jurisdiction. The Court of Appeals, however, reversed this.
And the Supreme Court agreed with the Court of Appeals, correct? What was their reasoning?
Yes, the Supreme Court sustained the CA. They found that a clerical error in the law, Section 124, Paragraph 3 of RA 6938, mistakenly referred to Section 47 when it should have referred to Section 46, which was the liability of directors. Once corrected, the penalty clearly fell within the RTC's jurisdiction, imprisonment of 5 to 10 years. The court emphasized that statutes must be read as a whole to carry out legislative intent.
That's a significant detail, correcting a legislative oversight to ensure proper jurisdiction. The case also clarifies that a dismissal for lack of jurisdiction isn't an acquittal and doesn't trigger double jeopardy, which is vital.
Absolutely. It means the accused isn't being retried on the merits. The previous proceeding was fundamentally flawed due to the wrong court hearing it. It's not a not guilty verdict on the evidence.
Next up, Morillo v. People deals with bouncing checks again, but brings up the transitory offense concept and the private complainant standing.
In Morillo, Richard Natividad issued post-dated checks that were deposited and dishonored in Makati, but the checks were issued and delivered in Pampanga. The defense argued Makati was the improper venue. The Supreme Court affirmed that Makati was a proper venue. As an essential ingredient, the deposit and dishonor occurred there. Violations of BP 22 are considered transitory crimes, meaning they can be prosecuted where any essential element took place.
And it also addressed the private complainant's right to pursue relief when the state doesn't support their position, which can be a tricky area.
Indeed, the general rule is that the state controls the criminal aspect. However, the court recognized an exception. Where exceptional circumstances or a denial of due process exists, the offended party can pursue relief, especially when the prosecution's position would leave a serious procedural wrong uncorrected. In this case, the conviction from the Metropolitan Trial Court was reinstated.
That balance between state control and private rights is crucial. Chiak v. People further explores who can challenge a criminal acquittal and the nuanced aspects of civil liability.
Wilfred Chiak was acquitted of estafa by the Court of Appeals due to reasonable doubt. Rufina Chua, the private complainant, then sought to challenge this acquittal. The Supreme Court reiterated that generally only the state, through the Office of the Solicitor General, can challenge a criminal acquittal. The private complainant's independent interest is typically limited to the civil liability.
So even if Chua felt strongly about the criminal aspect, she didn't have the standing.
That's correct. Double jeopardy protected the acquittal from an ordinary private challenge. However, the court did find Chiak civilly liable. An acquittal based on reasonable doubt doesn't automatically extinguish civil liability, which can be proven by a lower standard, preponderance of evidence, unless the judgment explicitly declares the act didn't exist.
That's an important distinction. Criminal acquittal isn't necessarily a shield against civil claims. Then we have the high-profile Laud versus Ginez-Jabalde case, which involved the Visiting Forces Agreement. This case raised significant questions about custody and jurisdiction.
Jennifer Laud's family sought to compel the transfer of U.S. serviceman Joseph Scott Pemberton from a military facility to the Olongapo City Jail during his trial. The issue centered on whether Philippine courts could enforce this transfer, given the VFA.
And the court dismissed the petition, right? What was the rationale for allowing Pemberton to remain in military custody?
The court ruled that while Philippine courts maintained criminal jurisdiction over the case, the VFA dictated the custody arrangements. It explicitly states that custody of U.S. personnel under Philippine jurisdiction shall immediately reside with United States military authorities if they so request. The petition failed to show grave abuse of discretion to justify a mandatory transfer that would disregard the treaty mechanism. It clarifies that jurisdiction to try a case is distinct from physical custody during trial.
So, international agreements can significantly impact how criminal procedure plays out, even within domestic courts. Atienza versus People brings us back to internal judicial matters, dealing with court employees accused of tampering with records and the reliability of circumstantial evidence.
Here, Ricardo Atienza and Alfredo Castro were convicted of robbery and falsification. The Supreme Court ultimately acquitted them, finding the circumstantial evidence insufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The evidence didn't form an unbroken chain that excluded other reasonable explanations.
Beyond the evidence, there was also a jurisdictional defect in the falsification charge, wasn't there?
Yes, absolutely crucial. The falsification charge, punishable by prison correctional, actually fell under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Trial Courts, not the Regional Trial Court. The Supreme Court reiterated that subject matter jurisdiction is conferred solely by law, cannot be waived, and can be raised at any stage of the proceedings.
A fundamental principle often overlooked. The Ombudsman v. De Haves case then delves into administrative proceedings against public officials, specifically addressing the impact of retirement.
Marcelino de Chavez, a college president, faced administrative charges of dishonesty. He retired while the case was pending. The Ombudsman still imposed dismissal-related penalties, which the Court of Appeals later reversed. The Supreme Court, however, sided with the Ombudsman.
So retirement didn't make the case moot.
Not at all. The court firmly held that jurisdiction that was ours at the time of the filing of the administrative complaint was not lost by the mere fact that the respondent public official had ceased to be in office during the pendency of his case. Allowing officials to evade accountability by simply retiring would set a dangerous precedent.
That's a vital principle for maintaining accountability in public service. The Garcia v. Executive Secretary case then explores the limits of judicial review, particularly concerning economic policy decisions.
Congressman Enrique Garcia challenged the constitutionality of Section 19 of the Oil Deregulation Law, arguing that implementing full deregulation, while an oligopoly existed, was against public interest. He asked the court to intervene in what was essentially a policy decision.
And the court dismissed his petition, classifying it as a political question. What exactly does that mean in this context?
It means the court determined that deciding the wisdom or timeliness of deregulation was a matter of policy, best left to the legislative and executive branches. Judicial review is for legality and constitutionality, not for substituting the court's judgment for the political departments on policy matters, absent a clear legal violation. It reinforces the separation of powers.
So courts are not there to second-guess economic policy unless it's explicitly illegal. Finally, People v. Sandiganbayan, Plaza, brings us back to the specific jurisdiction of the Sandiganbayan, particularly concerning local officials.
This case involved a Sangguniang Panlungsod member, Rolando Plaza, with a salary grade below 27, charged with violating the auditing code. The Sandiganbayan initially dismissed the case for lack of jurisdiction.
But the Supreme Court reversed that decision. Why did the Sandiganbayan actually have jurisdiction despite the salary grade?
Because membership in the Sangguniang Panlungsod is one of the positions specifically enumerated in the law, PD number 1606 as amended by RA 8249, regardless of the salary grade threshold. The offense was also committed in relation to office. The court clarified that the specific enumeration overrides the general salary grade requirement for certain officials.
These cases truly underscore that criminal procedure, particularly the rules around jurisdiction, venue, and proper charging, are complex and fundamental. They ensure fairness to the accused, define the limits of judicial power, and clarify the roles of various legal bodies. Understanding these preliminary considerations is essential for grasping the entire criminal justice process.
Absolutely, Lily. From where an offense is tried to who can prosecute and what constitutes a valid charge, these cases illustrate that the devil is often in the details, and the Supreme Court consistently strives to maintain a delicate balance between procedural regularity and the pursuit of justice.
If you found this discussion insightful, consider sharing this episode with others who might benefit from a deeper understanding of criminal procedure.